My first encounter with a strange art film called Begotten began right here on YouTube. Quite a few creepy style YouTube channels have used clips from this film as either a dedicated segment in their video or just as background aesthetic to elevate the tone of their video. Although I was familiar with these strange scenes and clips, I would forget the name of the film quite often, and I'd only stumble across it every once in a while whenever my memory of its haunting scenes would resurface. And it wasn't until I watched Begotten properly that I realised how many unexpected and thought-inducing themes it contains that go far beyond the notion of mere body horror. Being an art film, Begotten is certainly not a film you'd expect to enjoy in the conventional sense. There is no dialogue, the music score is subtle and minimal, with only ambience and foley sounds being present. The film is displayed entirely in black and white, with deliberately grainy and saturated quality. And of course, the film is infamous for its disturbing and violent imagery. Due to this imagery and vagueness in the plot, a lot of people on the internet dismiss this movie as being nothing short of some kind of snuff film, and the reactions of most YouTubers on this film have been pretty entertaining so far. So my curiosity in Begotten only increased the more I saw people's dramatic responses on what I initially thought was a simple horror movie with slight spiritual themes. But as I mentioned, after watching it through properly, I realised that there is so much more going on that, in my opinion, this film should be regarded as an incredibly underrated work of passion and creativity. Yes, there are still horrific and graphic scenes that should not be taken lightly, but if you thought gore and violence was supposed to be the main focus or selling point of Begotten, think again. There are lots of elements to be left to our own interpretation, but there is a clear and obvious theme of humanity facing the concept of eternity, references to mythology and the occult, and most crucially, the notion of death and rebirth. The more I researched, the more captivating this film became for me. From the way the movie was filmed, right up until its struggles to be released to audiences, there is a significant amount of fascinating information missing on YouTube about this movie. So I thought I would share some of this information with you today, and I should probably advise a short disclaimer before we proceed, that even though I won't be showing too much graphic detail of the movie in this review, some scenes may still be quite disturbing for more sensitive viewers. Also, if it will be of concern to you, some movie spoilers will be mentioned in this video, as I will be talking through the plot of a film from start to finish for the purpose of context. So if you have not seen this movie before and decide to continue watching, please do so with that in mind. I've been very excited to finally do a video on this baffling piece of media, and I really hope you enjoy it. Welcome to another video. Today we explore the infamous film of Begotten. The film begins rather ominously, with a title card that reads, "Language bearers, photographers, diary makers. You with your memory are dead, frozen, lost in a presence that never stops passing. Here lives the incantation of matter, a language forever." The second title card then appears that reads, "Like a flame burning away the darkness, life is flesh on bone, convulsing above the ground." It is common for silent films to have title cards to help the audience understand the narrative. The text at the beginning of Begotten, however, is essentially there to immerse a viewer into more of a certain frame of mind when watching the film. The words are purposefully ambiguous in order to raise a non-specific perspective from the audience, unique to each person, to create a personal experience for the viewer. As the words fade to black, the crackly sound of static then fades into the sound of the wind howling in the background. Then the title of the film emerges. As the film begins, we are introduced to a very rough and grungy style of black and white footage, with dust and scratches leaking onto the film throughout. The camera slowly fades into a broken household. As the camera moves inside the house, the infamous image of Begotten already appears as a man sitting on the chair, covered in sheets, dressed in white robes and a crude mask. He's also covered in patches of blood and convulsing uncontrollably. This man is credited in the film as God killing himself. And sure enough, the disturbing character shortly reveals his hand holding a razor and he begins to slash himself with it. The character does not speak, scream, or make any noise of any kind. The only sound that can be heard in this uncomfortable scene is the sound of nature, the noise of cicadas, the chirping of birds and crickets, and the rustle of leaves or tree branches, and also the sound of what I think might actually be a shishi-odoshi fountain, as the sound is water-like, rhythmic, and hollow like the clonking sound of bamboo. As the scene continues, so does the confusing and graphic displays of dismemberment and disembowelment, until he eventually succumbs to his fatal self-infliction. After what just transpired, the sound begins to change into a euphoric ambient melody, and a woman described as Mother Earth begins to emerge from the blood-stained sheets of the corpse. As she rises to her feet, she holds her chest and keeps her head raised facing the ceiling, as if in some kind of spiritual trance. She too is wearing a mask, this time a sort of Venetian mask or masquerade ball mask, covering only her eyes and nose. She continues to spin around in a dreamlike trance, with her hands still clasping her chest and her head pulled back. She then stops to turn and face the mutilated corpse of God behind her. And this is where the film takes on a peculiar turn. To briefly summarise, for the purpose of keeping this video up on YouTube, Mother Earth moves back towards the corpse to, let's just say, relieve him, after which she artificially inseminates herself. The next scene takes us back to Mother Earth, standing in the wilderness next to a coffin, apparently containing the corpse of God. Her side profile reveals that she is now pregnant, caressing her womb as the coffin next to her mysteriously fades out of view. Mother Earth wanders to the edge of a lake or pond, and the sound of cicadas and crickets once again being prominent in the background. Underneath these sounds of nature is also the very subtle sound of a heartbeat thumping rhythmically. A series of abstract visuals smear and flash on the screen, later revealing the shuddering body of a young man who is malformed and covered in mud, lying on his back on the ground. This character is represented as the Son of Earth, or Flesh on Bone, who is apparently left by Mother Earth to fend for himself, as she continues to wander off into the distance. As the Son of Earth proceeds to spasm and gasp for air, the scene fades to black and returns to him still lying helplessly on the ground, as faceless figures appear from the mist-covered background. The nomadic people are eerily represented in hooded robes and making slow, rigid movements. The sun begins to rise as the figures edge closer to the Son of Earth, circling around him as he begins to convulse more violently, with the uncomfortable sounds of choking and gasping for air take the forefront of the soundtrack. The mysterious nomadic figures begin to apprehend the Son of Earth, dragging him and binding him with supposedly his own umbilical cord and carrying him around the rocky barren landscape. The scene is incredibly disorientating, with no real passing of time made clear due to the fluctuating light fading in and out, as the figures carry the Son of Earth through the ravines and rocky hillsides. They eventually tie his umbilical cord to a boulder, in which the convulsing Son of Earth then appears to regurgitate unconfirmed organic matter in graphic detail. The nomads take heed of this, crouching over his body, watching him vomit with eager anticipation. It seems the nomadic kidnappers regard the body organ-like objects as gifts, impatiently taking them from him as he continues to regurgitate. This distressing scene continues for a long while, until the nomads, apparently satisfied with their new and gruesome gifts, continue to drag the powerless Son of Earth up the hillside. A hard cut to a scene of a fire being ignited is then displayed, apparently started by one of the nomadic figures. The rest of the group appear with the Son of Earth over the hilltop, until laying him down beside the fire, where they proceed to repeatedly stab and beat him until finally being thrown into the flames to perish, whilst in the background the sun begins to set behind the mountains. The next scene greets us with Mother Earth again, who unexpectedly returns to her son to resurrect him from the ashes. The sun rises and reveals the Son of Earth to be alive and now clothed in a white sheet. Mother Earth ties the umbilical cord around his neck to serve as a leash as she leads him away into the forest. The calming ambient music can be heard again, swooping in underneath the noises of nature, and the shots of her carrying her son away into the woods weave in and out of each other, creating a very bewildering atmosphere and dreamlike passing of time. Shortly after, the cloaked nomadic pillagers make an appearance again after encountering Mother Earth and her son, who have now ventured out of the forest into another barren rocky landscape. There is then a rather curious scene of Mother Earth and Son of Earth being found by the nomads while she is leading him across what appears to be 3 large concrete cylinders. A tense atmosphere begins to manifest as the nomads, now appearing to be wearing masks, stare down at the convulsing body of the Son of Earth, patiently waiting. Suddenly, a nomad strikes out at the Son of Earth, bludgeoning his head in graphic detail, yet remains conscious and continues to convulse. All the while, the character of Mother Earth is standing motionless in a trance, again with her head raised to the sky, whilst the nomads continue to ruthlessly beat and torture her son. A series of 2 different silhouetted shots of Mother Earth being struck on the head are then displayed, followed by her being mercilessly beaten, dismembered, and ravaged by the nomads. The scene is incredibly nightmarish and jarring as the low frame rate of the footage and blurred images flash on screen, leaving you feeling drained and confused, trying to make sense of the imagery, yet forcing you to want to look away at the same time. Simultaneously, there is a bizarre sound of birds chirping frantically in the background, almost as if the birds are in distress. As the scene ends and the nomads disappear, the soothing music from before once again fades in over the shots of the afternoon sun and Mother Earth's motionless body. Nearby, her son is sat beside her, staring down at her corpse. A new group of mysterious robed figures slowly appear in front of him to silently collect the body of Mother Earth and take her away. The son mourns the loss of his mother as they carry her away, to which we then see another 2 members of the robed figures carrying a large cauldron over towards where they proceed to cut her apart and place her inside the cauldron piece by piece. The robed men carry her and the cauldron off into the distance as the scene ends. The howling sound of wind then fades in, alongside the shots of a dark and terrible desert-like landscape, with the Son of Earth crawling slowly across the sand. As the sun rises, the sandy plateau is revealed to actually be a beach, with waves crashing in the background. Here is when the Son of Earth is greeted once again by these new mysterious cloaked men, who without warning strike the sun with a large hammer, to then take him back to the same place where his mother was cut to pieces, and inevitably suffer the same fate. The cloaked men place him in a second cauldron, to again be carried off over the hills. What happens next is not overly clear, but the robed men are next seen to arrive with the cauldron carrying the remains of Son of Earth towards where the rest of the group appear to pound and drill Mother Earth's remains into the soil and partially bury them. As they proceed to do the same with the Son of Earth's remains, time-lapse footage of wilting flowers and leaves and branches begin to play, shortly followed by the imagery of Mother Earth leading her son through the woodland as we saw them before. A quick shot of a mutilated corpse can then be seen, followed by a final shot of the forest that suddenly cuts to black, and then the film ends. My first initial thoughts when watching this film were pretty similar to everyone else, somewhere along the lines of being fascinated yet simultaneously bewildered to what exactly I just witnessed. I found the brutal and violent scenes particularly hard to watch at times, but I also remembered some interesting scenes that were thought-provoking, and I enjoyed the ambient soundtrack. I just sort of shrugged it off as one of those not bad, not great movies that I'd probably need to rewatch, but would never be interested enough to do so. However, in the end, fascination did get the better of me, and I watched it a few more times. And what I was surprised to notice was my perception of the film changed more and more from confused, uncomfortable fear to recognizing deeper interpretations to the characters and the surreal storytelling. I then began to look further into how and why exactly this bizarre film was made, and how exactly it gathered such infamous attention online decades after its release. Let's imagine for a second going back in time to the year 1990, the year that Begotten was eventually released. For any horror movie fans, this was a pretty exciting year to be alive in. We had films like Tremors, Misery, Night of the Living Dead, the It television film, and well, okay, fair enough. Not all horror movies that year were that good, I guess. But the point is, horror movies during this time were still considered to be fairly profitable films, even if some filmmakers involved were relatively new on the scene and still had a lot to prove. But what I was surprised to find when I first began researching is that on no lists on horror movies released in 1990 does the film Begotten appear as an entry. So what does that mean? Does Begotten not class as a horror movie then? Was this film so obscure when released that it just simply slipped under the radar of horror movies and became a cult film only decades later? Was there simply no market for this film when it was released? These were the kind of questions I had when I first saw Begotten. But in hindsight, I realised my first approach to this movie was completely warped by the internet, with the label of horror movie typically being thrown around right, left and centre when looking for further information on it. Even websites such as tvtropes.org labelled Begotten as a surreal horror film. But Begotten is not a horror movie. It certainly has elements of body horror contained in the film, but again, this is not a horror movie. This should generally be considered as an art film, and I think this is exactly where most of the obscurity and misinterpretation of this film originates from, but we will get further into that in due course. First of all, we should probably focus on who exactly made this film to begin with. Was it an artist, a filmmaker, a film student? Well, as it turns out, the brains behind this film happen to be from a far more interesting background than I first realised. The project began from the workings of Edmund Elias Merridge, who more commonly is referred to as E. Elias Merridge, born in Brooklyn, New York in 1964. During his years as a student in a New York State University, he began becoming heavily inspired in theatre and theatrical performances. He would actively attend many performances around the Manhattan area, particularly seeking performers who would create visualized forms of storytelling through dramatic movements to provoke what Merridge called an otherworldly response. This would later prompt Merridge to found his own theatre production company called THEATREOFMATERIAL, and would debut many experimental performances throughout the city. As it turns out, Begotten itself was inspired by theatre originally. By the time he was in his 20s, the foundations of Begotten were already in Merridge's head, and he was eager to finally begin expressing himself. In interviews, Merridge has stated that he was heavily inspired by films and theatre performances that would unapologetically stray from the contemporary formula. He was also passionate in philosophy and would eventually read The Birth of Tragedy, written by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The book is fairly difficult to explain without doing a proper in-depth video on it, but for those unfamiliar with the book, the writings were essentially referencing Athenian drama and Greek tragedies to explain the theories and the significance of art and how it profoundly intertwines with human life, essentially to embrace suffering through art as a way to overcome it. Although the book was heavily criticised and controversial, Merridge was moved by the book and the notions of art becoming something more tangible, something that we can easily connect to and experience on a more subconscious level. Driven by the idea of making something that could transport the viewer from comfortable familiarity into something more reflective and conceptual, Merridge began planning how Begotten would be represented. His original concept was for Begotten to be sort of a dance performance to be accompanied by a live orchestra. This, however, proved to be far beyond his budget to logistically produce, so the decision was beginning to arise to instead represent it as a motion picture, and Merridge would quickly begin rewriting a script, completed only within 6 months. Although still young at the time, Merridge was no stranger to filmmaking. From as early as 1983, he had worked on several short films such as Implosion, Spring Rain, and A Taste of Youth, which had already earned him recognition and experience to finally begin working on Begotten. Working alongside his peers in his newly formed company THEATREOFMATERIAL, the decision was made that if Begotten was to be made into a film, it should be a silent film, in order to focus on a more emotion-evoking approach, which Merridge would describe as emotions on the fringes. During the script writing process and early rehearsals, Merridge would even experiment with his own cast and crew with ritualistic meditations and hypnosis, in attempts to create a state of mind that would purposefully allow the actors to express what Merridge was trying to convey. This would certainly explain the surreal and almost dance-like movements of the characters that we see in the film. Not only similar to a dance performance, but it's almost like a ritual-like experience that we see presented in the film. Merridge has even described working on the film as being a powerful, almost ceremonial experience that changed the lives of all those involved. The film was shot locally in New York State between New York City and New Jersey at a construction site. This would probably explain the concrete cylinders that we can see briefly in the film at one point. Merridge was given 20 days of filming time by the construction site, and the site workers would even occasionally lend a hand to the film crew by constructing landscapes when certain shots of mountains were needed during the scene. I was also fascinated by how Merridge claimed to deliberately make the film quality rough and grainy looking, not an attempt to make it look like an early 1930s movie, but as if, and I quote, the film itself were an artifact that has been damaged and degraded over vast stretches of time. Indeed, before filming Begotten, Merridge had in fact worked as a special effects designer for various companies, including a brief job for a Disney television series that involved rotoscoping. These jobs had provided him with the knowledge and savings that he needed to go on to create visual effects of his own. Merridge would go on to extreme lengths to achieve the look that he desired. He would even use sandpaper to create scratches on the film negative before shooting a scene, and even go on to design his own optical printing machine, built with spare parts from camera stores and special effects studios where he had previously worked at. Although it would prove to be a long-winded process to make the film look like this, and it would damage or even ruin the film negatives on occasion, it would still prove to be an interesting style that Merridge presented for the film. To me, this not only gives the film more depth in its concept, but it's also a testament to the creativity of the people involved in the project, as well as the lengths that Merridge went to in order to present the work in the most honest way possible. Even the soundtrack, although incredibly minimal and far from the main focus of the film, had a very specific thought process behind it. According to Merridge, the film was chosen to have no dialogue as he envisioned an ancient time when spoken language was not yet evident, and that language is spoken on a more sensory level. Again, further emphasizing the feeling of watching something made millennia ago or something made in another universe. The subtle, mysterious ambient music that we hear, as well as the sound effects, were produced by part-time composer Evan Album, who predominantly worked as a painter and completed the soundtrack within a year and working closely with Merridge to find the right balance of visual and audio cues. After many more months of editing and fine-tuning the film, Begotten was now ready for release, and the arduous challenge of finding its place in the competitive film industry had now begun. During 1990, a period in which the internet was still relatively new, it was near impossible for aspiring filmmakers to independently distribute their work without the use of, say, social media and online video hosting sites to help push the film forwards towards more specific target audiences on a more global scale. Professional film distributors were really an only option, and as far as film distributors were concerned back then, a new film by a new filmmaker with no real previous successes would only be worth distributing should it fit a pre-existing target audience, an audience that would guarantee a profit with minimal risks. This would prove to be a huge challenge for Merridge. During a 2-year-long effort, Merridge and Begotten were rejected on a regular basis and even laughed at, as distributors would be unable to grasp the concept and claimed the film simply did not fit in any specific genre, making it difficult to bring the film to market. This would continue even when Merridge would proceed to release the film in galleries and museums, some of which would show interest but ultimately would turn Merridge down, leaving Merridge to become increasingly more secretive of his movie and more protective of it, showing it only to his most trusted associates. Upon privately showing Begotten to film critics Peter Scarlett, Tom Luddy, and Susan Sontag, they were surprised and impressed by the film, endeared by the film's unique style and artistic representation. and would agree to screen the film at various film festivals such as the San Francisco International and Berlin Film Festival. Sontag in particular would be a leading supporter of the film, even claiming it to be an artistic masterpiece. During one of Sontag's screenings, it was supposedly viewed by director Werner Herzog, who Merage later admitted was very supportive of the film. As briefly touched upon earlier in the video, although this was released in 1990, no cinematic release list around this year includes Begotten on the list, quite simply because no theatrical release for Begotten was ever organised. And so for a good number of years, Begotten would unfortunately exist only in film festival screenings and art galleries. No solidified audience for the film, apart from critics and other filmmakers, existed. This film felt almost destined to gather dust and slip away from existence over time. That was until Merage had one significant change of his beliefs that would later engrave Begotten's legacy. Merage for a long time stood against the idea of the film being readily available to experience through the medium of VHS tapes. However, through the desire to come back to the post-production side of Begotten and improve the mix of his soundtrack, he would eventually change his mind on this and proceed with releasing VHS copies of the film via the company World Artists Home Video on March 10th, 1995. And later Begotten would eventually be available on DVD from February 20th, 2001. The film now, though, sadly, is out of print and unavailable to buy from any commercial retailers. This was a particularly unfortunate thing for me to learn, as me trying to get a physical copy of this film was near impossible unless I basically was willing to spend nearly £100 for a copy, which, quite frankly, it could be a bootleg, and for a one-off video, it just wasn't quite worth it enough for me to go and buy me a copy. Although, as you'll see across YouTube, there is a good selection of channels who do in fact have a copy of Begotten, and I was surprised to hear a pattern of where exactly they had acquired their copies from. Most of these channels claim to picking up their rare copy of Begotten from horror movie conventions, and I, for one, find this to be an intriguing evolution for the audience of Begotten. Begotten from the very beginning never had a clear market, yet has almost naturally slipped into the category of horror movie over the years. I'm not sure if I agree wholeheartedly with this, as the film was created for purely artistic purposes, as we've seen and discussed, rather than to appeal to the horror movie fan base. Even a lot of the more open-minded horror movie fans are still consistently confused by this film. But then I guess this seems like the only logical path that Begotten would take, as our concept of films has changed since the 90s, with cinematic films generally having a target audience planned before the film is even produced. People are increasingly more drawn towards the weird underground phenomena of media, with avid film fans beginning to look far beyond the cinema screen or streaming service, and more towards mediums like YouTube and movie conventions for that one needle in a haystack film that they are subconsciously hunting for. And it's clear to see content creators are inspired by this film, or at least the imagery of it, yet because of its obscurity, made even more obscure by the fact that it's generally labelled as that one weird black and white horror movie that you may or may not find in a horror movie convention, I feel a real significance and purpose behind Begotten has been sadly overlooked over time. Instead of focusing on the spiritualistic and artistic aspects of a film, we focus on the creepy gifs and imagery that we find out of context across the internet. Even near the beginning, the image of God killing himself was apparently the image World Artists Home Videos decided to slap on the front cover of the DVDs and VHS tapes. I mean, imagine for a second not knowing a single thing about Begotten and seeing this cover for the first time. Would you even think for 1 second this was supposed to be an art film? I suppose what I'm trying to say is that even though the film has clearly gained a lot of notable attention on a global scale now, I still can't help but feel it remains incredibly misinterpreted and underrated. In hindsight, I think it might have even been better received if it remained as a stage performance, as it might not have endured such a competitive and close-minded market, and the audience would be far more receptive and have a stronger grasp on the concept. Begotten very much does feel like a genre of stage performance rather than a genre of film, and although it's clear that Merage was a completely competent enough filmmaker, this project might still have been just a little too ahead of its time. And I say that like it's a bad thing, but imagine if this was uploaded onto YouTube independently, for example. imagine the response he would receive. Though he would probably have to cut a whole lot of scenes out of his film to even try, I suppose. But I mean, we've seen filmmakers before make their mark on YouTube first before making it into Hollywood movies, and we know it's a perfectly respectable way of aspiring directors to get into the industry. But most importantly, something like YouTube would have given Merridge full control from the beginning, and possibly prevent Begotten slipping so far into that what the fuck category on the internet. When I first decided to do a video on Begotten, I had absolutely no idea what exactly my angle or approach would be, but after rewatching it a couple of times, researching Edmund Elias Merridge and learning from the history of the film, I sincerely hope the main takeaway from Begotten is that it's simply not some creepy movie starring creepy people made by some creep, because the talents of Merridge and the hard work that he endured for this film is truly inspiring and from a very pure place. Yes, some of the imagery is very disturbing and very hard to watch at times, of course, but then the message of the film is objectively a brutal one, and from quite a phlegmatic point of view, that we're made aware of from the very beginning of the film. The plot of the film is essentially about death and the meaninglessness of flesh when faced with the concept of reincarnation. It tackles the meaning of time and the possibilities of living consciously beyond the flesh. It's an ancient tale that's been told in many ways in many different cultures for centuries. A concept that Merridge has told in interviews that is very inspired by. I think the main reason why a lot of us feel so confused when watching Begotten for the first time is because we're often introduced to it with presumptions in our heads. If we're introduced to Begotten in a way like, here's a creepy movie that makes Eraserhead seem like Ernest Saves Christmas, instead of watching it with a completely open mind, then it's no wonder this film is going to get a fairly bad rep. But at the same time, I'm not for 1 second saying that no good has come out of Begotten. Begotten did earn Merridge notoriety as a talented filmmaker and built a foundation for himself to go on to create critically acclaimed films. Shadow of the Vampire, starring John Malkovich and William You Know How Much I Sacrificed Dafoe, proved to be a huge success, and directed by the exact same filmmaker who brought us this surreal art film. His interviews are fascinating, and he comes across as a very forward-thinking director, even to this day. Begotten is, of course, far from a perfect masterpiece though. It is not without its technical problems, and I think it's even something that Merridge would agree to, considering it was one of his earliest projects. A lot of people who even like Begotten still complain that the pacing of the film is exhausting and boring at times, and I would be lying if I said I disagree with that. The violence presented can be incredibly uncomfortable, and even on occasion over the top or unnecessary. At times, some of the abstract imagery just looks confusing and distracting, even though I still find myself enjoying the more symbolic and abstract scenes in Begotten far more than anything else. And like I said in the intro, it's simply not a film you would watch in the conventional sense, or in the same way you'd watch the Conjuring movies, for example. It's a film that's meant to provoke a certain experience, whether good or bad. It's not supposed to tell one specific story, and it's clearly evident that this movie was not made for mainstream audiences from the very beginning. Therefore, I know it's still going to be seen as a very controversial film with very divided opinions for quite a long time. At first, I thought I could analyse and break down exactly what I think the film means in my own opinion, scene for scene, but now that I'm at this stage, in a way I think that would actually be a detriment to the message I want to convey for Begotten, which is just to have as open of a mind as possible and watch the film the way Merridge intended. And then I guess think and interpret what you will in a way that it relates to you personally. And if you happen to come across a copy of Begotten at a convention somewhere, just make sure it's not a bootleg, because you might just have yourself a little piece of filmmaking history on your hands. Thank you so much for watching this video. I just wanted to quickly give a big personal thank you to all the viewers and subscribers of this channel, because this channel has just recently reached over 15,000 subs, which is just insane to me. It's crazy. Thank you so much. I honestly had no idea that there would be that many people out there interested in this kind of content, but the Brian Charnley video, for example, recently reached over 800,000 views, which is just unbelievable. Thank you so much. It really does mean a lot. And second of all, I'm really excited to introduce a new feature in my videos called Artist Corner, where each video I basically get to show art directly from you guys. This is something I wanted to do for a long time, because I'm not just inspired by art from famous people. I get inspired by all kinds of art from all walks of life. I think art is something that seems to be devalued more and more by society, it seems, or at least it does from my experience. But I'm hopeful that somehow through YouTube we can find a new way to increase exposure for independent artists out there. And so to kickstart this new feature, I'm excited to introduce you to our first independent artist called Frank Hyler. Frank is a conceptual artist currently based in Denver, originally from New Jersey, USA. Frank for a long time was struggling with depression until he discovered the work of Zdzisław Beksiński and was instantly inspired to start painting. By the time Frank had perfected his talents, he says he's finally been able to give his feelings and thoughts a physical presence, where before he simply could not express himself to others in a way that they could understand. Art has proven to be a saviour to his life, and I have to say, whilst looking at his work, it's very clear to see Frank truly pours his heart and soul into his paintings, and I particularly love his painting titled Sacrifice. The symbolism is incredibly powerful in this work, with the scratched and cracked holes over the heart and head. The use of dark metallic blue shades of colour really amplify a lot of raw feelings in this painting, and I just have to give credit where it's due. He truly is a talented artist, and I'm honoured to feature his work today. If you'd like to see more of Frank's work, please follow the links in the description below and go and show him some support. And of course, if you're watching this video and you're an independent artist who'd like to feature in one of my videos, then I'd love to hear from you. Please send me an email to blinddweller@gmail.com, along with a short paragraph about yourself and of course your artwork. I look through every single email that I receive, so please get in touch if you potentially want to shout out in a future video. And that's about all from me. Thank you all again for your support as always. I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye for now.